Hey, guess what? It's .NET Rocks. I'm Carl Franklin.
And I'm Richard Campbell.
And Dom and Brock are with us. It's going to be a great show. But first of all, my friend, are you ready for Minnesota and for Dev Intersection and all that stuff that already happened, but it hasn't happened in our lives?
All that stuff will already happen because time shifting is hard, right?
Time shifting is fun.
Yeah. Christmas is effectively upon us by the time this show comes out.
Yeah. Well, hopefully everything was good.
I'm sure it was fantastic.
I take it you had a good time on .NET Conf?
Yeah, it was exciting to be in the studio with the crew and, doing all the craziness it is throwing to different stages. They did a crossover with GitHub Universe, so I got to hand over to Scott Hanselman, who then was interacting with Brian Randall. So it was all the faces you recognize, all the troublemakers. It was
Mr. Road Rage.
Oh yeah. Why so angry?
Why so angry? I was thinking about that the other day. Neither here nor there. All right, let's roll the music for Better Know Framework. Go.
Awesome. All right, man, what do you got?
All right, well, this being the first recording that we've done since the launch of .NET 7, I figured I would pick out a few of my favorite things in announcing ASP.NET Core in .NET 7, this blog post by Daniel Roth. Sort of what's new.
Saw him the other day.
Yeah, and this is all new stuff, right? But there's some really interesting things happening in .NET 7, not just in terms of overall performance, but check this out. On the server, HTTP 3. Yay. And WebSockets finally can use HTTP 2.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So HTTP 3 new.
Faster.
Oh, and WebSockets is coming up a little bit. Not quite to HTTP 3. So that's interesting to me. gRPC gets some really cool stuff, JSON transcoding, which means that if you have gRPC services, you can expose them as JSON-based APIs. That's kind of interesting. But on the Blazor side, there's some really cool stuff. One is binding after get set. So run async logic after data binding and independently control how data binding gets and sets the data. So this is really cool because sometimes when you've bound something and it changes, the UI changes and that's all great. But what if you need to get notified? What if you need to run some code when that something changes? Well, you typically have to create events and then subscribe to those events. Now you have to implement iDisposable and yada, yada, yada. It just adds a bunch of overhead. And just a bunch of code. But this basically allows you to run code after a binding changes, which is really, really cool. So anyway, I've linked to that. Of course, this is episode 1824. So if you go to 1824.pwop.me or just go to .netrocks.com, we'll link to this page.
Awesome.
So that's what I got. What do you got, Richard?
Grabbed a comment off of show 1818, which just published recently, where we talked to David Whitney when we were at NBC in Oslo about open source.
That was fun.
We're going to have to talk a little bit about open source today as well. And Craig's comment is, open source is fantastic, but I've always wondered why IdentityServer was free for the purpose it serves. Yeah, we should ask about that. But Craig goes on to say, NPM should have a billing process. There are so many libraries that are out of date, unsupported, and have degraded references that if we were to pay to use the system in place, we could play a hand in encouraging people to actually maintain their own libraries. Yeah, interesting point, right? Creates some incentive to do a good job around there. It's the dependency problem is a huge one, and we got to do a better job of dealing with it as a whole. Craig, we're having a great conversation about IdentityServer today, so I thought your comment was super appropriate, and thank you so much for it. And a copy of Music Code By is on its way to you. And if you'd like a copy of Music Code By, write a comment on the website at .netrocks.com or on the Facebooks. We publish every show there. And if you comment there and I read it on the show, we'll send you a copy of Music Code By.
And follow us on Twitter. He's at Rich Campbell. I'm at Carl Franklin. Send us a tweet. I think we're still on Twitter. Are we still on Twitter? Does Twitter still exist? What's going on with Twitter?
I don't know. I'd say send us a Mastodon, but I don't even know what that is.
Oh, my. All right, let's bring back to the show Dominick Baier and Brock Allen. Dominick spent most of his professional career implementing security systems for his customers and reading protocol specs. This resulted in a number of popular open source projects like IdentityServer and Identity Model. Since 2020, he runs Duende Software Incorporated together with his longtime friend and colleague, Brock Allen. Duende provides a sustainable home for the IdentityServer project and is the one-stop shop for all things OpenID Connect and OAuth for .NET-based companies. Brock Allen has worked for many years as an application security architect and has specialized in .NET web development and web-based security for over 20 years. During that time, he co-authored several open source security frameworks, including IdentityServer, Identity Model, and OIDC-client-JS. He's also an MVP and a contributor to the ASP.NET platform, but most recently he co-founded Duende Software with his colleague of many years, Dominick Baier, and he also still hasn't returned my calls for going out to dinner on Federal Hill in Providence, Rhode Island. Which we still have to do, my friend. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And yes, absolutely. We should go out for dinner. That's a good idea.
Yeah. Why not? It's the best Italian food on the East Coast is right there.
Yep.
Should we call it open source? Discuss.
Well, so first of all, I guess by the wonders of time travel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yesterday will be the day when we archive the open source project called IdentityServer.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right. So basically, we synchronized the lifetime of this project with the lifetime of the underlying .NET Core runtime, which is .NET Core 3.1 will officially be end of lifed, if that is a verb, on the 13th of December, which means we are officially done with open source and now focus completely on source open.
Ah, yes. Nice. Source open.
What's old is new again.
I think it's a great point. You know, this idea. It's not like the source code isn't available. You're just treating it differently. So what do you define different for source open versus open source?
So, again, we didn't, like as all of what we did in the last 10 or 15 years, there was no grand plan behind that, right? So,
right.
I think I told this story many times, that IdentityServer really was just, a big sample that went along a blog post that I wrote, back then. And because, the blogging system I used was really bad at putting, source code in HTML, I just separated it, moved it to a different server. The server was called CodePlex. And that was the sample that went along with the blog post. Yeah. And that's how we did that for many years. It was really just a byproduct of the consulting work we were doing because we, implemented a couple of these token servers and started to see the pattern. Like what are the things that are always the same? What are the things that are changing for every customer?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
In a lot of ways, the classic open source story, right? You're writing code to learn and to help your customers, but you also share it with others.
Well, I think the classic open source story has a bit more ideology to it, right? I mean, like, there was, as I said, basically it was just a way to get out some source code alongside the blog post I was writing. That was really the intention, right?
Right.
And this just became popular. Yeah. And it became really popular the moment we decided that we're going to turn it into a framework, right? So with version 3 of IdentityServer, where, like new stuff was happening in the .NET space, like Ovin and Katana, right? And OAuth and OpenID Connect and so on. We turned this into a framework because we saw that we can fill a gap here because all of the off-the-shelf products were not flexible enough, at least for our customers, right? So, and today, I think most of these off-the-shelf products, they are okay if you have a greenfield scenario or if your company works exactly like they think it should work. Mm-hmm. But IdentityServer was designed for all of the other cases where the framework should work like you need it to work, right? And then I guess with version 4 of IdentityServer, when we made the switch to ASP.NET Core, this whole thing really just exploded and became just bigger than the both of us, right? And in preparation of the show, I looked at some websites and so on, and I looked at, for example, the NuGet feed, right? I mean, I think there were like over 30 million downloads of that NuGet package, for example, right? Which is a lot for a pretty niche thing, if you think about it, right? It's, I mean, we're not AutoMapper, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, you're not dev tools. The point being, I mean, so many of these popular open source projects are dev tools built by devs for devs. This stuff's enterprise software.
Yeah, we never planned it to be like this, but it turns out to be, right? And at the same time, when you go to the GitHub page of the old IdentityServer project and look at the contributor graph, you basically see that, or everybody that decided to use this open source thing in their company should have seen that it's unhealthy.
Yeah.
Because there are basically 2 people maintaining it, right? Like, I mean, I don't know, Brock and I have like 1,000 commits each, and then the next person has 20 commits, right?
Right.
And that was a guy actually that we worked with, yeah. So, and then after that, people have like 3 commits, right? So this was a clear indicator, and we didn't see it early enough, right? That we were creating this huge thing that on one hand has millions and millions of downloads, but on the other hand doesn't work like an open source project because, well, there's no, it's basically just us producing some code in our spare time, really.
In a sense, though, we kind of fell into this because like you said, I mean, the popularity of open source was becoming a thing, and all the like marketing pitches, even Microsoft, switched around, and they're like, "Hey, look how great open source is," and we kind of didn't know any better, in a sense, I think, right?
Right. We were definitely young-ish and naive, very naive, maybe not so young, but and it felt like a cool thing to do. But
you were certainly being encouraged at every turn. I mean, we've talked routinely for a decade.
Right.
About identity and things. And at every turn, it was, you were one of the poster childs of the open source community. And this is this great product. Like you were a success story.
Yeah. But that's also, it's difficult to compare us to a Microsoft open source project.
Oh, sure. You're not $1 trillion company.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was the thing that we missed or just couldn't foresee or whatever, just couldn't anticipate that you can't compare the two.
No, I mean, what definitely changed was while we were not paying attention to this open source thing, the meaning of, or the perception of open source has changed, right? Yeah. Going from this hippie, GNU style thing to basically open source is a marketing term for the big companies now these days. I mean, you can't not do open source if you are in the developer space, right? So, I mean, that the source code is available, and that brings us probably back to the discussion here, is pretty much a given these days if you're working in the dev space, right? But the term open source, I think, is these days pretty much just a marketing term, because it's basically a thing that big companies use, right? And pump a lot of money in and use that as saying, hey, open source, we love open source, right?
Mm. The other thing too is that there's a very strict definition of open source.
Right. Which we get to, I think, later on, because that's what people told us later on. While we were doing the transition, people pointed out, you can't call yourself open source anymore, and that's the first time I actually thought about this. Yeah. So, but I mean, since now basically, it's over. The repo is archived, right? It's a bit like, the JFK files. They are now declassified. We can talk about this. What really happened, right?
Mm-hmm, right.
So, and we got a lot of good, but also a lot of really harsh feedback. When we made the decision that something has to change, right? But basically the whole question we had to ask ourselves is, how is this sustainable, right? I mean, we were doing 9 to 5 jobs, doing consulting, and 5 to 9 we were working on the code base. Yeah. And this was fun while this was a smallish code base, but it's got bigger and bigger, right? And the more specs needed to be implemented, and it just was becoming more and more work, right? And we had to look at what could be a business model for us, right? And there are certainly business models out there that might work for some people. For example, the open core model, right? Where you say, like, okay, we have this core thing, and now we produce add-ons around this that are commercial, right? So we thought about this, but we really made a decision that the core is our main product. Right. So we want to work on the core.
You didn't want to take features away from use. It has to be usable. And if it's usable, it's complete.
But also that we really always thought like we are working on the core thing, and that's all we care about, really, right?
Right.
The framework is the core, and now to produce, then additional things we need more developers. I mean, working on the core was already a full-time job.
Right.
So. Adding more to that.
And that's another good example why we're not the same as ASP.NET being an open source project, right? Because that is a vehicle to get into the other products from Microsoft,
Right. Microsoft.
IdentityServer was the product, right?
Right. Yeah. Microsoft can give that away because they sell you Azure to use it.
Exactly.
There are some, successful companies out there that use the open core model, like, for example, Aaron Stannard's Akka.net, right? They have, monitoring tools around that they sell and so on. And it works for them, right? The other model that often people said we should do is the services model, right? Where you basically have an open source project and then sell consulting and professional services around that, right? But we were already doing that, right? I mean, Brock and I were pretty much maxed out with consulting work. And again, nor me nor Brock felt like creating like a consulting company, right? Where we hire consultants and I mean, everybody who does consulting knows it's hard, right?
Well, it's another whole business. Now you're going to run a consulting practice on top of everything else.
Yeah.
Right.
And I really, never really had a lot of respect for these consulting companies. I mean, just the way they do, they have to do work to be profitable, right? Because, in consulting, there's a linear relationship between work and money, right? I mean, the more you work, the more money you get. If you get
work
sick,
an hour, bill an
no
hour,
money, right? So this didn't work for us, right? We went down the sponsorship thing. Yeah, we did the Patreon thing, and there's this famous talk from Aaron Hammer about how sponsorship is just not sustainable because it's just you can't foresee how much you get and so on. Sponsorship is not sustainable.
Right.
We think for open source projects. Yeah. It's nice. It's a nice thing if you from time to time get some money, but there's nothing, you can't hire someone based on sponsorship money because you.
No, you can't, because you got to pay them every month no matter what.
Right.
So, it's not that simple. People aren't perfectly fungible. And, as we've well learned, and these sponsorship models aren't that reliable.
No.
You need reliable income. But didn't you also get pressure from your customers too?
Well, I mean, there were definitely meetings where people said like, we don't like open source. We want to pay money for a license, right? And, like an old school manager type of person, right? He was sitting in the meeting and he was saying, yeah, all you're saying makes sense, but why do you have this weird business model? Right. And again, by the time I didn't perceive this as a business model, it was like my business model was consulting, and this open source thing was just something we worked on the side and just became alive on its own. Right. I mean, long story short, basically, this didn't work out. Right. And the last thing, to be honest, the last straw we were catching was like, keeping the conversation going with Microsoft about making IdentityServer part of .NET itself. Yeah.
Right.
and I have lots of thoughts about this, and I think what I really want to say is it was the worst idea ever for many reasons. Yeah. And before somebody again says I'm a hypocrite here, I think it was a bad idea, and both Microsoft, or I shouldn't say Microsoft, the ASP.NET team and us, we learned from this, right? I think where it went wrong with all of this is that the ASP.NET team thought they're going to have to solve the problem themselves, right?
Right.
Like some customer was asking for API security or, SPA authentication, but whatever, use case they threw at them. And the ASP.NET team felt inclined that they have to solve the problem themselves, right? If you look at any other web framework, like Node and Ruby and you name them, none of them have a built-in token server. None of them.
Right.
Right.
Well, do you think MSAL is a result of all of the Azure AD B2C identity providers and all the things that they do there? They just wanted a sort of a seamless thing. And Visual Studio has a lot to do with it too, right? I mean, up until the last version of Visual Studio, if you created a new, say, a Blazor server application with individual accounts, hey, the first thing that comes up is this README file that says, we're using Duende's identity server, and this can't be used in production unless you have a license, and go here.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly what I'm talking about, right? So I think where the whole discussion went wrong is that Microsoft only saw two ways to solve the problem. One is to build their own token server, right? Like that they put into .NET Framework, which they did, right? I mean, that's a little known fact, but they worked for 1 year on their own token server to replace IdentityServer, so to speak. And that was purely a politically motivated decision. And at some point, and then they announced the plan, and then they got all of the not invented here thing going on, right? And then they said, okay, so we only have two options. One is build ourselves. One is use a popular open source project. What is what the community wants, right? And the community is typically the people that are the loudest people on Reddit and on GitHub issue tracker, right? And they wanted, identity server, right? So they changed completely. They turned around 100%. Okay, let's delete this thing we worked on for 1 year. I mean, there was a developer that worked for 1 year on a token server, and they deleted the repo.
Ouch. Wow.
Right? I felt really bad for him.
Yeah, no, that sucks.
And the unfortunate thing is he's the guy who then had to put identity server into
right.
the templates for Visual Studio.
Oh, man. That's just mean. That is mean.
And now, so basically, looking back at this, all right, I think what really would have been the solution is that Microsoft works on a more flexible templating engine where you can say, I want the MVC template with Azure AD. I wanted the MVC template with IdentityServer. I want, that you can mix and match technologies instead of having this. And you're seeing the same exact discussion going on in the DI space and in the logging space, right? People want MVC with Serilog. People want, Razor pages with structure map, right? I mean, in my opinion, instead of spending all that money of trying to build a token service, they should have spent that money on creating a composable templating system, so to speak, to empower the community to plug into the product, right? Which is another sad thing, right? I mean, the community is it's in the Microsoft space, right? I mean, you have to be kind of scared or frightened that every day, once you have a popular open source thing that becomes successful, that Microsoft just decides to replace this with a product.
Yeah.
Right. And that happened in the past a couple of times. So that's also the trust issues that they have, right? So I mean, to close that thought, we did this. No one would believe that, but I think we started talking to Microsoft, or they started talking to us in 2012 for the first time about the idea of putting that stuff into .NET, and it took them 8 years or something, or 7 years before this plan could be executed. And
Microsoft time.
And it was technically technically wrong that one big framework aggregates another big framework. I mean, the technical tension was big. We had to synchronize release dates. I mean, there were times when I had to stay up like 12 o'clock and like 24 hours before the official release date, we had to do a release using the unreleased NuGet packages. Like that basically all of the stars line up basically on the release day, so to speak, right? Because there's a chicken egg problem here, right? Which might not be an issue if you are just a library, but given the fact that we sit so close to the metal, so to speak, right? We had to synchronize the releases. There were many occasions where Microsoft had to roll back a change in .NET because it broke us. Yeah, Entity Framework did some changes. Suddenly we were not binary compatible anymore with them, right? So they had to roll back those changes because their templates would have been broken on. It wasn't a good idea. And then to put the nail in the coffin here, basically, it turns out that in the end, and that was our hope, right? Given Microsoft would use this, there would be some better sponsoring money in there, so we can maybe hire an engineer, for example. And then it turns out they paid us $12,000 USD per year. And that was supposed to be generous.
That'd pay for pizza.
Yeah. You're not gonna get a dev for that.
No.
Dom, what do you say to someone who says you should just sell it to Microsoft?
Many people said that, right? Microsoft should just buy them, right?
Yeah.
They all assume that would be our big dream in our lives, to work for Microsoft, yeah.
Yeah.
Which I think isn't at least in my case, yeah. And I'm not sure what selling to Microsoft would have. I mean, the code base is too big for Microsoft to maintain it. It would only make sense if they would buy the maintainers, I guess, with.
Yeah, you guys have to come with, and that's not what you want to do either.
And then try to, ASP.NET is, from an org chart point of view, underneath Azure. Why would a subdivision of Azure spend money to buy a competing product to Azure AD?
And therein lies the other big problem, the dynamic between Azure AD and Identity Server. But we should break for a very important message.
Yes, we should. Hey, it's Carl and Richard here. We're here with our friend JD Trask from Raygun.
Hey, JD.
Howdy.
We thought we'd just talk to you for a second about how Raygun got started. How did the whole thing come together?
It wasn't our first product. We actually built a range of different tech companies prior to launching Raygun, and we built Raygun off the back of how Jeremy and I, the JB of the JD-JB duo, had been monitoring our software previously, where we would email ourselves if there was a fault, and we wanted to build a full system around that.
Who would do that? I guess I have.
It's a nightmare going all into your inbox. So that was the inspiration.
Yeah,
that's a great story, and it's a great product. Thanks for making it.
Oh, no, it's our pleasure. I honestly think, if I was building a business today, putting something like that in from the get-go, we see customers where they adopt that sort of technology early, and the number of issues they have sort of stays very, very low, from the get-go. It's really impressive when you see really large companies that are actually not sending very many errors because they've taken that quality so seriously from the beginning, as well as helping larger companies sort of, bring those numbers down and lower the number of faults. It's really cool to see.
Well, we use Raygun at .NETRocks.com, and it does its job. It tells us when there are errors, but we haven't really fixed them yet. So
we do have a permanently ignore function for you there, Carl.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. Well, thanks. Let's do this again.
Thank you.
All right. And if you'd like to know more about Raygun, go to raygun.com and try out a free trial. And we're back. It's .NET Rocks. I'm Richard Campbell. That's Carl Franklin.
Hey.
Talking to our friends Dominick Baier and Brock Allen about the recent archiving of Identity Server. And also this whole thought of should an Identity Server just been part of Microsoft? I think it's people, anybody who hasn't actually been in this situation, it's always this dream of I'll make this thing and Microsoft to buy it and everything be perfect. Right. Except you almost certainly have to come with. But meantime, somebody else inside of Microsoft built an identity product.
Whatever happened to Glimpse? Remember that?
Well, both, Anthony and co went to Microsoft, right? And then got put onto other teams. And and the products get absorbed. Like now you get into the politics of products inside of Microsoft. So
right.
Yeah.
So anyway,
I don't think we were
prepared
for that.
It's safe to say that neither Brock or me wanted to be part of this. Yeah. So, and to be honest, I totally remember this one morning, NDC London 2020. That was like the last NDC before COVID. I was sitting at breakfast and I was just having this epiphany, like saying, what if, right? We would create a company, keep the current open source version free and maintained for the next 2 years, but work on a new product, right?
Right.
And then after 2 years, which is basically today, yesterday, or however you want to see it, we will basically archive this thing. And from this point on, it will be source open only, no more open source.
I did pull up Glimpse. I included it in the show notes. Archived repository.
Right.
It's funny how that happens.
Wow.
Right. And I think it's very, very important to say that and then I had to pitch this idea to Brock, right? Because he wasn't with me. So I called him after NDC and then 2020 happened, right? And there was a lot of time you were grounded basically and had to reflect on what's going on in your life. And I pitched this idea to Brock and said like, hey, why can't we try? I mean, we have to accept the fact we failed. Yeah. Making this sustainable on a voluntary payment basis.
Right.
Right. This is not going to work. We learned our lessons. We tried many things. It doesn't work like this, right? Can we try to, entertain the idea of, can we create a company where we can balance the work between, like the open source, hobbyists, small business people with the big dollar companies, right? And make it fair for everyone, which is, it would be great. Yeah, if that would be easy to do, like a fair trade open source. Yeah.
Right.
And that's what we started working on. And at the same time, we wanted to maintain the lifestyle. We didn't want to create a consulting company. We didn't want to hire 30 developers. We didn't want to take venture capital. All of these things was just not what we wanted to do.
Right.
And that's basically why we created Duende and made this announcement in October 2020.
And it was scary. Absolutely scary to do.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's not obvious when you start down any given path that this will be the right path. It's just not obvious. You have to find out along the way. But I mean, it's been 2 years now, guys. What's happened? Like, are you happier?
Yes. I mean, I can say 100% I'm much happier now. Because I think, we found a solution to the fair trade software thing.
Right.
We can talk about this a little bit more in more detail. And B, so we have a mutual friend, right? Adam Kogan.
Yes.
And I spoke to him when we created the company. And he gave me some, good business advice, because this was way out of our comfort zone, right? I mean, we were doing like consulting for 20 years and so on, like suddenly dealing with, like great, contracts, attorneys, all of that stuff. And he said to me like, yeah, Dom, you know what? I have an attorney and I'm talking to this attorney every week for at least 1 hour. And I think you will do the same thing. And I thought like, yeah, if that's what's going to happen, I don't want this. And guess
that's
what's happening?
kind of reality.
Yes. And now I have a weekly call with our attorney.
Yeah. Here you
What
are.
did you know?
Because that's just the reality of the business world. And again, we can talk about this a little bit later. That's definitely a downside, right? So, I mean, so my main message is basically, I would encourage everyone doing open source today thinking about doing a similar thing.
Right.
Right. If they are confident enough, they have a product, which we were confident enough that we have a product and that it produces value to other people. And if that's the case, companies will buy the product. In many cases, these companies will be happier in buying a license than flying under the radar of procurement and using this open source thing.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that came out of our talk with David Whitney, was that exactly that. Companies were saying, who do we pay? They want to pay, because that puts you on the hook for helping them when they have problems.
Yeah.
Right?
And I'm so happy, well, for the product and for the customers that we now have this revenue stream, because we have people, we've built a support organization, documentation and samples, and we're totally, was it the right thing? Absolutely. Because we set out on that mission to keep the product around, right? I mean, the alternative 2 or 3 years ago would have been just to let it die.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I'm sure there's some people upset with you.
Oh yeah. I just got an email 2 weeks ago. I can read it to you. Yeah. I'll give you a short version of it.
Okay.
But basically, what this guy says is that it is pretty shameful how we took advantage of Microsoft, including you in their official documentation and examples for financial gain. Greed. To what end? Shame on you and all who work for you.
Oh, yeah.
That was just an email I got 2 weeks ago.
How do you sleep at night?
Sadly,
well, because I've known you for a long time, Dom, and you are a very greedy guy.
You are shameful.
I'm wondering if it's a badge of honor if somebody says that 2 people took advantage of $1 trillion company. I don't know.
Yes, that's a hell of a trick.
Yeah,
and as always, these messages come in anonymously, right?
Yeah,
they're not using their real email address and so on. So, and there were like more harsher messages I got.
I think you picked a polite one.
Yeah.
I'm also a firm advocate is if you're doing something important, you're going to upset someone. That's inevitable.
Right. Well, So anyway, so we made this decision, and we didn't have a good start, right? Because, and that's another lesson learned is, part of the Microsoft deal, so to speak, was they told us to be able to put you into the product, you need to join the .NET Foundation.
All right.
And from back then, this seemed like a fine thing, right? I mean, somebody reviewed the contracts. It looked all very harmless, but it turns out that when we then mentioned these plans that based on that contract, we were not allowed to change our license, right? Basically, and that's one of the advices I would give everyone. If you have even remotely the idea of turning your open source thing into a business at some point, you should not give anyone a perpetual, worldwide, non-exclusive, royalty-free, irrevocable license. That's exactly what you do when you're joining a foundation.
Yeah, that's pretty rough. I wouldn't sign that.
So in their defense, they changed a little bit their mindset. So now they make it possible now to leave the foundation and to change the license and so on. But
you guys essentially pushed the .NET Foundation to mature enough to create a coherent exit path.
Yes, but we were met with the most hostile response to that.
Oh, I bet, without a doubt. And from one of the largest companies on the planet being mad at you is not a good day.
Yeah. When Microsoft lawyers are mentioned on the phone call, and that's the last thing you want to hear when you just started a new company.
Yeah.
Right. So we had to rebrand, right? And every business person will tell you rebranding is the worst thing you can do.
Yep.
It was, but this was a cleaner cut. And by the time, to be honest, there was no way out. Yeah. Just a couple of weeks ago, I think, this graphics library, I forgot the name now, left the foundation to change their license. There was, I think, Martin, which is a document database. They left the foundation as well to pursue.
It was Image Sharp has left.
Right. Image Sharp, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And that people have, different people are now in charge of the .NET Foundation, which I think is very good. More open, more mature views, and they made it possible now that. And what I really like is, and I give Rich Lander all of the credit here. He said he coined the term when an open source project graduates to become a commercial project. Right? Yeah. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. But it's not an inevitability either. There are different paths for open source to thrive. And this is one of the paths. I think this is part of open source maturing. Right, is that we acknowledge that these things do evolve, and one of the paths is to go commercial.
Yeah. Success story is what that is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
And you guys are part of blazing that route. Of cutting the trail of here's one of the commercial paths. The problem with blazing a route is there's lots of roots in the ground and you trip.
Right.
Don't fall on your machete. It's bad.
So one thing that kept us busy and still keeps us busy is the license, right? So that's one of the most challenging things we had to think about. So if we stop using Apache 2, what will be the license, right? And we tried several ways. Like we started with the RPL. There's like a dual license approach. Like what if it's open. If it's an open source project that want to use it, you can use the RPL. Otherwise, it's a commercial license. But there are loopholes in these licenses. For example, the RPL says you have to, if you're using this project, you have to open source your product as well. For example,
right? Yeah.
Right? But what you could do with the RPL is, for example, create a cloud service, right? Open source that source code of that cloud service, but still use all kinds of RPL licensed products, for example, and make money, probably much more than whatever, and don't have to pay the authors of that open source license. Yeah?
Right.
So you are not allowed, and that now gets us into the whole source open thing. You are not allowed to change the RPL because then it's not an RPL anymore.
Right. That's the nature of licenses. Don't change them.
And we thought the RPL might be a good thing because it's an OSI approved license. But once we found out that the RPL doesn't work really, we thought, okay, so what's the point of having an OSI license at all? Right. Yeah. And then some people pointed us to opensource.org, which apparently is hosts the official definition of open source, right? And what this definition says is if it's not free, free as in beer, not
free beer,
yeah, not like a puppy.
It is not, you are not allowed to call it open source. Okay. So that's kind of like an antiquated way to see how that world works, right?
Yeah.
But basically the very first point says if it is not free, right, it is not open source. Or you can't call it open source. The free distribution, right? The other thing that it says is that the license must allow modifications and derived work and must allow them to be distributed under the same terms as the original software, right? All of this is not compatible with any type of commercial product, right? So yeah, we had to learn because there are always people out there that will tell you that you are doing it wrong. We had to learn that it's not open source anymore. It's called source open.
Right.
And basically the only difference between open source and source open is, and to be honest, none of our customers care about this. The only thing they care about is that they can download the source code and debug through it or read it or whatever, right? Is that, open source must be free and source open doesn't need to be. Yeah? And that is, just what we had to learn. So we removed the word open source from all our websites, right? It's not an open source project anymore. If somebody asks, I tell them it's source open, which then I have to explain for 30 minutes afterwards what that means.
Right.
And then we said, okay, why don't we just come up with a completely custom license? And that custom license means that if you are an individual or a small company or whatever, and you're making less than $1 million revenue per year, the software is free for you. Full stop. Right. And that's nothing new. It's inspired by Visual Studio Community Edition.
Right. Sure. And also if you're a registered charity, right? Yeah.
Yes. Charities as well. Right. But if you're making more than 1 million and you're not a charity, then I think you make enough money to pay for the license. And we don't, and that's the only discount we have. And we are very strict about this, that basically either you are 1 million less or 1 million above. And that's basically how that works.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of like fulfilled the task we had, that we want to create something fair.
How does that work? Do companies actually have to send you their tax returns?
No.
Is it reported somewhere? I don't know how this works.
No. I mean, we do some due diligence, but so, and I can report, that we have more than 50%, right, Brock? More than 50%.
No, it's somewhere between a third and half of our licenses are under this community edition, which is to say they're free.
Right.
Okay.
And there are so many like small, right. I mean, like if somebody writes you like from Colombia or, Peru, whatever, right? I mean, it's pretty likely that they're going to be under 1 million US.
Sure. Yeah, we're not talking about necessarily Western nations. Small company Western nations, one thing.
No.
But developing world is where this is going to make the biggest difference.
But there are also tons of people who are doing startups and or they're just small companies. And we were trying our best to have kind of the equivalent continuity from having come from the open source to still have this, like Dominick said, I think trying to have a fair license is the right way to think about it. And it's resulted in a meeting with a lawyer every week for 2 years.
Right. Just to get to this point.
Is the community edition binary compatible with the older open source version 4?
The community edition is our full-blown product. They just don't have to pay the annual subscription fee. So they get all the bells and whistles plus all the features that we've added over the last 2 years.
But will my code that runs against IdentityServer 4 work with the community edition? I guess that's what I'm saying.
You have to, just like any major release of any product, right? You have to update to keep up with whatever changes are. But the short answer is yes.
Yeah, that's to use my favorite Microsoft term, it's conceptually compatible.
Okay.
Good. Nice.
I mean, it lives in a different namespace, right? But I think our APIs are 99% the same.
Yeah,
what has
great.
changed a little bit?
That's really good.
The database over time, right? But basically, just to make that clear, our community edition, the thing we give away for free, is the same thing as our enterprise edition.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
And we had some customers or companies in the past that actually graduated from community to a paid one.
Right, that's great.
And that's I guess a good success story.
And I might add, not shameful.
Yeah,
not shameful.
Thank you for that.
Not at all. That's pretty freaking awesome.
So what's going to happen on GitHub then for Duende?
Nothing. I mean, we are using the same methodologies that we used in open source. It's just a different license.
Yeah, but it also, just to be clear, we forked our own repo. We have a whole different organization on GitHub.
Right.
So the fact that the repo is archived is the old IdentityServer 4 repo. We have a whole new org, a whole new repo. All the development that we've been doing the last 2.5 years is under this new,
and still on GitHub.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Under a different license.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
The only thing I think that that's not really something that started with Duende, but we are more reluctant to take pull requests these days, for example, because we realized that this thing got so complicated that most people, they don't spend enough time to understand the whole thing and just want to solve their particular problem, that they make a pull request and then we find out like 3 months later, this has side effects on something else, for example. Yeah. So we still encourage pull requests, but more like as a conversation starter, right? But at the end of the day, we typically prefer to make these code changes ourselves. Yeah. And that is not because we want to be rude or whatever. It's more like, there's a great responsibility here now.
Well, and as you've learned, right, this is not simple software to work on. It's complex.
No. And in an attempt to be more, community encouraging in the old repo under the old open source, we were trying to take those PRs.
Right.
And allow people to get involved more. But like Dominick said, right, I mean, this ended up causing other problems down the road. So, no more drive-by PRs.
Drive-by PRs
is what we call them.
And by the way,
the YOLO PR.
Duende, by the way, duendesoftware.com looks really good. And just from answering the question, what is this point of view? Big purple, banner. And I like the way it says, we help companies using .NET to build identity, not authentication, and access control, not authorization, solutions for modern applications. That's great. I mean, you basically translated geek speak into human speak, which is one sentence. It's a great website.
It actually used to contain the word open source somewhere at some point, but we had to remove it because we were told we're doing it wrong. So it's source open now.
Well, it's a poster child for what a good website should be.
Thanks.
Well, yeah, thank you. The other thing is that is I think is really nice is that we were able to now employ basically four technical engineers. Like give them enough work that they are, that was something we were not able to do before. But now, there's enough work. There's, money for that. And we have samples, and documentation and consulting and all of these things. And we could just, have basically give work to other people, which felt great. Yeah.
That's excellent.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of a sign you may have that you're going down the right path, that it's thriving. More customers, more work being done, feature growth, more people working on it.
I think the word that you're looking for is sustainable.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that. What a concept without having to kill yourself, right?
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, I mean, as I said, I would encourage more people. I hope there are many open source maintainers listening to this now. I would encourage you to think about this. Yeah. I know it's out of your comfort zone and it sounds complicated and it certainly is stressful to start with, but I think it is the right, way forward if you want to keep this thing alive, because otherwise, as your NPM comment said, people just abandon the project and it's not NPM's job to solve this problem, right? If there's nothing in for the maintainer, why would the maintainer stay?
Yeah, exactly. And you're seeing that all over the landscape. The lack of support, the abuse that they take, like what do you think was going to happen?
And I think and I don't really want to sound too negative here. I still think coding is fun, right? And open source is totally fine. But over the last years, there has been this mindset, which I, in hindsight, just don't get, right? So when you are going to GitHub and you're opening a new repo, what is the very first thing that GitHub tries to push you to do?
License.
Choose a license.
Yeah.
Why? Right. I mean, basically what you are saying, if you're adding a license to your code, is that commercial entities can use it.
Right.
Right? So if coding is for fun, don't add a license. I mean, and the moment you're adding a license basically means I'm open for business. And then make sure you know what your currency is, right?
Yeah.
Is it fame? Is it recognition? Is it maybe you want to get hired by a company? Or do you want to turn this into a business at some point, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that is the thing, right? With all of this open source hype, that, everyone does open source, right? And we love open source and open source is so cool, right? This gets lost a little bit, right? That, don't do open source for open source sake. If you want to code, do it, but you don't have to become, an open source project in the original definition, which requires a license, right?
Yeah.
And once you have the license, make sure you know what you're getting into, right?
Yeah.
And you probably don't. And whatever license you pick, it's almost certainly wrong long term.
Well, and that's why you shouldn't pick a license. You shouldn't pick a license at all because you are protected by copyright.
Yes. It's easier to say the license should be, we're just I'm in the copyright stage right now as I experiment. Will be changed at some point.
Yeah. And I
was going to say, I had repos that I neglected to put a license in years ago, and I was contacted by companies who were like, hey, this is a cool library. We'd really like to use it, but there's no license at all.
Right.
Are we allowed to and all that? And so that was very nice of them to follow the copyright rules.
Right.
And so that's why you
and at the same time, you're able to go to say there isn't one for a reason.
Right.
No, you're not. It's not time for you to use it yet.
It's actually,
of course, I didn't have the benefit of listening to this podcast, 5 or 10 years ago when I then turned around and said, oh, let me go add an Apache 2 license for you. But, yeah.
I mean, the very first time somebody contacted me and said, like, your blog does not have a license. I didn't even know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
It is just for fun, right? I'm writing some blog
posts.
What's
your problem? That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Just read it.
So, one thing I want to mention again is last week on or the last show with David Whitney, he mentioned that there should be like a billing feature, right, for NuGet feeds or on GitHub or whatever, right? And again, I want to point out that there's Aaron Stannard out there working on SDK bin, which is exactly this. It's a NuGet feed with a business model, right? That's cool. I met him in Oslo a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him about the status. And he says, well, but beginning 2023, he's going to be open for business. So they basically only sold their own library so far to understand, the business and the edge cases and so on. But next year he's going to start onboarding external projects, right? And the idea is simple, right? It's like an app store for NuGet packages, right? You have something you want to work on, or you have something you work on and you think it adds value. Put a price tag on it. Put it on his feed.
I think that's great.
And that's a business automation, because that's the biggest downside of it, right? The amount of custom business interactions we have with companies, right? Like, custom contracts, these super complicated procurement processes out there, right? Yeah.
Well, I know that you can create your own NuGet feed, right? Like DevExpress and all these other third-party tool companies do this. You have to create your own NuGet feed, and you only get access to it if you've paid for it, right?
Yeah, but I think what SDK bin is giving you is Aaron is helping you with all of the legal stuff and all that other stuff, which is the impedance for developers taking their own little homegrown project and turning it into a company, which is the 2 years that we had gone through, and we had to learn all that. So that's actually a beautiful idea that he's doing, that the developer can then stay focused on working on the code, and he can help with all the business side.
Because that's what you got into this for in the first place.
Yeah, it's like the PayPal for NuGet.
Yeah, right.
Right. And let's just hope, that none of the big companies, so
wait a minute, finish your thought there, buddy.
I really hope he succeeds.
Yeah.
I really hope he will succeed with this idea, and I really hope that it will not happen in a way that GitHub or Microsoft will say, "Oh, look at that, this works. Now let's do it ourselves as well."
Yeah, but of course they're going to. If there's money to be made and there's something to be exploited, they'll do it.
Right. But anyways, sdkbin.com. Yeah, that's what people should look into, or get in touch with Aaron. He's interested starting this thing, going public next year. Great. I bug Jimmy every week to put AutoMapper on SDK bin. Yeah. I mean, take some, $1.99, right? Or maybe on Cyber Friday, make it cheaper. And that would fly under the radar probably of most procurement departments, right? And something you can pay with a credit card. And suddenly he has this a sustainable open source project, and can work on that and doesn't have to do consulting on the side. That's just what my opinion.
That's very cool.
By the way, $1.99, you mean $1.99, right?
Yeah, sometimes, It's AutoMapper.
I can make tens of dollars.
Yeah, but there are many projects out there that would probably work like this. I think so.
This is great.
Yeah, it sounds like Steam for coders,
Yeah, we're going to definitely have to have Aaron back on to talk about that. SDKbin.com. We'll also add it to the show notes. Hey, guys, this has been great. Congratulations on the launch of Duende, and what can I say? More power to you, and come back and tell us how it's doing next year.
Great. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time on Federal Hill in one of those great restaurants.
Absolutely.
.NET rocks. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net and produced by Plop Studios, a full-service audio, video, and post-production facility located physically in New London, Connecticut, and, of course, in the cloud. Online at pwop.com. Visit our website at dotnetrocks.com for RSS feeds, downloads, mobile apps, comments, and access to the full archives going back to show number 1, recorded in September 2002. And make sure you check out our sponsors. They keep us in business. Now go write some code. See you next time.
Transmitter banned by the FCC. Yes, I'm a